Welcome back, everybody. We are going to have a pretty awesome lecture today. This is Chapter 5, The Nature of Language, and this chapter really is, I think, the best iteration of what we first understood in Chapter 1 as the transactional communication model. And while in Chapter 1, we learned about the transactional communication model, we didn't really get a chance to dive super deep into the symbolism behind communication, as well as the rules of language as involved in communication. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. And so one of the first things that we learn in this chapter is that one of the biggest pieces of the language, the nature of language, is that language is symbolic. What that means, that very phrase, that language is symbolic, refers to this idea that we have to remember that the words we've created to describe our reality are just that. They're just symbols. They have no direct connection to really anything in our reality. So for example, I'm going to use this cup as my first example of this. So we've kind of said that we have a symbol for this item in reality called the cup. And the word cup has no bearing on what this thing is. If I change the name of this object, if I change it to something called a floopy floppy, then that still doesn't change what this thing is. All I did was change the symbol, which may change the way you think about it, right? Floopy floppy sounds a little bit more silly than cup. However, the point I'm trying to make with this is that despite the fact that we may feel it, all of the words that we use to describe our reality can't effectively truly describe reality because they are just symbolic. Words are completely arbitrary symbols. And so why does that matter to us? That matters to us for two reasons. One, it reminds us that language is governed by rules created by human beings. And secondly, and most importantly, it tells us that words do not have meaning in and of themselves. People give words meaning. So let's talk a little bit about this first idea of the rules of language, and then we'll talk a little bit about how human beings give words meaning and why we care about that. So there are 4 rules that are provided to you in the chapter, and I've kind of distilled them here to make them a little bit easier to tackle as you're learning them. And so we'll go through top to bottom. First is phonological rules. These are rules that govern how something is pronounced. Of course, all of you, when you were going through K through 12, were taught by your kindergarten teachers how to say different letters of the alphabet. You have things like long A, short A, right? The different sounds that various vowels can make, and you're learned to pronounce words correctly in the way that these words were intended to be pronounced officially in the English language. And of course, for those of you who are bilingual or trilingual or quadrilingual in the house, you have probably been taught a lot of different phonological rules based off the various languages you may know. Next up is syntactic rules. These govern the way symbols can be arranged, and for every language, it varies, of course, and it's important because the way a sentence is structured and the rules surrounding that really lend a lot to someone's culture, someone's worldview, and ultimately how they perceive themselves and others, because if you use language to describe yourself and others, the language or this tool that you're using to describe your reality, of course, will impact your reality and how you see it. And we'll get to that later when we talk about various theories that relate to worldview and language. But back to syntactic rules, one difference of syntactic rules, for example, from Spanish to English, is the presence of an adjective. So if I were to say that that's a cute dog, right, I would put the word cute in front of dog. So in English, the adjective would go before the noun. But in Spanish, oftentimes the noun goes first and then the adjective goes second. So for example, you would say pero gordo, the fat dog, right? But gordo, fat, would go after the noun pero, instead of in English where we would say that's a fat dog. Next up is semantic rules. This governs the meaning of various statements. And so you might have heard people say in the past, oh, it's just semantics, right? Because once we get various symbols or words together in a sentence, those sentences can mean different things in different contexts, right? If chapters 1 through 4 haven't taught you that already, it's very important to bring in the contextual meaning of things, especially because in our language, we have a lot of idioms, we have a lot of sayings, that mean semantically different things than what literally the symbols refer to. So for example, things like it's raining cats and dogs, right? It's not literally raining cats and dogs. Someone would have to understand that idiom in context in order to understand what the person is saying. And so semantic rules govern the meaning of statements, not just in idioms, but also whether or not we take something literally or we take it figuratively, and also how we pull in context in our decoding of the message. And last one is pragmatic rules. And this tells us how we can interpret something appropriate to a given context. So while semantic rules deal with both the dictionary definition and the also known as the denotative meaning of a word, and how we can interpret things in that context. Pragmatic rules deal more in the realm of connotative meanings, meanings that aren't literally in the dictionary, but things that are agreed upon socially. And I'll touch on pragmatic rules as an example later when we get to powerless and a powerful speech. So here you'll see this awesome triangle of meaning. And so earlier I said that we care about the fact that language is symbolic for two reasons. The first reason we care about the idea that language is symbolic is because it reminds us that there are rules to language, as I just covered. But the second part of that is that it also reminds us that words do not have meaning in and of themselves. Humans, people, are the ones that give words meaning. That old saying, that you may have heard from some of your K through 12 teachers of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That saying is not entirely accurate because words are incredibly hurtful, and they can be incredibly hurtful, not just because of the fact that they are words themselves, but the meaning that the person who is sending those words to you imbue them with, right? Just in the way, as Muhammad Khatani talked about, just in the way that your mouth can spit venom, your mouth can also mend a broken soul. So just in the way that by choosing kind things to say to someone, we can uplift them, we can also say really cruel and mean things to someone that can put someone down. And that's not because of the words themselves, it's because the meaning that we as people are imbuing in those words as we are sending them to the intended target. And so I want to call your attention to this wonderful triangle right here. You'll see my cursor kind of moving around. Let me scoot up so you can see. And here you see the user. That's you. That's the person using the language. And then we see the symbol and the referent, which is the thing. So one example of how we can understand this triangle is think of a dog. So if I said the word dog, that's a symbol. And I'm the user of that symbol. And when I say the word dog, I am probably going to imagine in my head my dog, right? He is large, he is a German Shepherd, he's brown, he's energetic, and he has a black face, and he has little dimples, and I'm imagining him. Because when I think of the word dog, I think of my dog. For some of you, you may think of your dog, which is maybe a completely different dog from mine. For some of you who do not have dogs, you might be thinking of someone else's dog that you know personally, or a generic dog like a golden retriever, or a beagle, or something or Snoopy, right, or Clifford the red dog. And so the referent of that symbol can vary a lot in terms of what you think of and what I think of when I say the word dog. And so that's why here there's this dotted line to remind you, like I said earlier, that there is no direct connection between a symbol and its referent. There's absolutely nothing in reality that says this creature must be called dog, D-O-G, right? But the only way these two things are connected, you see these two solid lines? They're connected by the user. So that, again, illustrates this point, that the symbol itself has no meaning. The user gives it meaning, and by being both connected to the user, the symbol and the referent are loosely connected to one another. Okay, so it's very important to recognize how words can impact others in a variety of ways. And now that we've looked at this triangle, let's go ahead and apply it to how language can impact our worldview. So there's this idea called linguistic relativism, which states that the worldview of a culture is shaped and reflected by the language of that the people speak. And a build-up on this idea of linguistic relativism specifically is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and it's named after the two researchers that helped develop it. And so Sapir and Whorf both hypothesized that the language that we speak has a direct impact on how we see the world and what we think of the world, and our opinions of it and how we feel the world should work. And so they give this example of people who are Eskimos who have, for example, 6 or 7 different ways of saying the word ice, whereas in English we only say the word ice once. And so that reminds us that the world that we live in, literally the ecosystem, the environment that we live in, impacts our language, and then our language becomes reflective of that worldview, and then it's cyclical. The language that we use to describe that worldview shapes the way we look at the worldview. And so it's important to look at this idea of linguistic relativism because it helps us see a lot of the threads of what we've been learning in chapters 2, 3, and 4 as far as perceiving the world in a specific way, and how as an individual, and from chapter 3, as an individual, your own self-concept, and culturally speaking from chapter 2, the language that you use impacts the way you see the world. So for example, in chapter 2, we learned about individualism and collectivism, right? And an individualist is someone that puts himself or herself before the group. A collectivist is someone that would put the group, like their family or their coworkers or their neighbors, ahead of their own needs. And so we find typically that individualist cultures like America, we use a lot less specific pronouns. So if you think of the English language and the pronouns we use you and I pretty much when we're referring to people. So I would say, how are you doing? I am doing well. And we really only have these 2 pronouns that we use in interpersonal relationships. Outside of that, when we're referring to other people, we use she, he, our, and we. But even then, that's not quite a lot compared to other languages that have tons of different pronouns to specifically refer to different people in relationship to themselves. So for example, in my native language of Vietnamese, there are a multitude of pronouns that I have to learn and use properly when I'm speaking with someone else. And so for example, if I'm meeting a colleague of mine who is around my age, but I know is older than me, I would call them big sister or big brother, right? Depending on if they are male or female. If they were older than me, I would call them miss, or I would call them uncle. And so I have a variety of these pronouns that I'm loosely translating from Vietnamese, but these are a variety of pronouns that I have to learn and know how to use in order to refer to those around me properly in relationship to myself. I also have to know, for example, how to refer to those who are younger than me, those who are incredibly senior to me in age and in power. And so you can see that because Asian cultures such as mine have a lot of pronouns specific to title and status built into their language, they tend to be more collectivist. Whereas in America, in English, we typically only use you and I when we're in interpersonal one-on-one settings. And so therefore, you see that our culture is incredibly individualistic. So what this idea reminds us of is that the way that we've built our language and how we continue to use that language as a tool to describe our worldview shapes and reflects our worldview and our culture continuously. So now let's go on to naming and identity. While we may not think of the impact of our names on a regular basis, names shape the way others think of us, how we think of ourselves, and the way that we act. There have been multiple studies done where they find that individuals with what we call in communication studies non-normative names, meaning names that are not common to the English language or common to American culture, tend to have a harder time getting interviews, getting phone calls back for interviews once they submit their names on a resume. And this is because when we view a name that we consider to be non-normative, we tend to imbue a lot of the stereotypical attitudes towards that name. As we kind of learned in chapter 4, perception is very important, and we all have these hidden biases and these constructs that we use to make sense of our world. So a Harvard study, for example, found that when candidates with non-normative names tried to Americanize their names a little bit more, they got a higher chance of being called back for a job interview. And I myself changed my name when I immigrated here from Vietnam. I, of course, had my natural-born Vietnamese name, but because it's a non-normative American name, it is Phương Thảo. Because of that, I changed my name to Ava in order to kind of move a little bit easier through the world. Ava is a lot easier to spell and to pronounce than Phương Thảo. However, people feel differently about that. Me personally, if I could change anything, I would actually go back in time and not change my name. And the only reason I changed my name was trying to belong and trying to fit in, and realizing that my name and people not being able to pronounce it or people thinking of it as weird was a big impact on my self-concept, as we learned in chapter 3. That reflected appraisal and that social comparison. No one really around me had a non-normative name. When I was growing up, most of my teachers couldn't say my name, but they could say every other student's name. And so because of that social comparison, as we learned in chapter 3, I was incredibly encouraged to change my name. However, other people with similar experiences to me love the fact that they changed their name to a more Americanized or normative version of their name. And so this experience can vary. And if you're someone that has changed their name, I encourage you to kind of self-reflect on how it is now impacted the way you view yourself and the way you act. And of course, it's not to say that I don't enjoy my current name right now. I love Ava, and I've built my career and written research and taught under this name. But I do recognize now as an adult coming back that I changed my name as a child because of that heavy need to belong and because of the social comparison that went along with it. And so it really shaped a lot of my identity growing up and became built into my self-concept, this person named Ava, right, that didn't really exist before until I decided to change my name. And so I encourage you to think about that as well. And it's always interesting as well to see what, if you have children, what you've named them, and to self-reflect on why you've named them what you've named them, and also to self-reflect on what your parents named you, right? Sometimes parents will name their children after a religious figure or someone already, an ancestor in their family, in order to imbue their child with the values of that religious figure or that ancestor. So it's always cool to think about how your name, how you got it, and how you use it now, how all of these factors impact your self-concept today. And like I said before, this is how all of these chapters really connect and really help us understand interpersonal communication in a holistic way, right? All right, going on with affiliation. So you can use language to converge or diverge in different ways. So converging is when you adapt someone's speech style to match that of others, and diverges is when you do not adapt and you speak in a way to try to emphasize difference. So what this refers to is this idea of whether or not we match the language style of those that we are interacting with. There is no doubt that if you have not already, I'm sure you have, but if you have not already, you will most likely meet someone who does not speak in the same language pattern and communication style as you. They may still, of course, speak English, but it's not a matter of language at this point. It's a matter of speaking style, right? The solidarity that you get with others. And so, for example, when I go and visit other states and present at conferences or do panel presentations or lectures, I often try to converge as much as possible when I'm meeting faculty or other colleagues from that state, because I want to make sure that I converge my speech style to match that of theirs, so that I show that there's this solidarity and this relationship between me and them, especially since I'm visiting their state. And you'll notice that in California, if you are a native Californian like I am, of course, I was born in Vietnam, but I've grown up all my life in California. So for all intents and purposes, I grew up Californian. And one of the ways that we speak in California is we have this kind of natural rise and fall cadence that we're very used to. And I notice that sometimes I do it as well. And I try to level out my voice a little bit more if I know I'm going to a different state. one example of this is you might be telling a story to a friend, and you might say something like, my friend and I went to the movies, and after we went to the movies, we got something to eat, but after we got something to eat, we didn't feel too good, and we felt kind of tired, so we just went back to her place. And you can see that there's this rise and fall in the way that I'm telling that story. And of course, not all of you may speak that way, but predominantly that is the what I call the California cadence, right? The way of melodically rising and falling as you're telling a story. And so I know that that's the way that I tend to speak as a Californian. I also know that I tend to speak rather quickly, one, because I am a communication studies major and was in debate, and so it's just a normal way of speaking for me, and two, that's also tends to be a product of living in certain pockets of California as well. I grew up in the Orange County and LA areas, and so I grew up around a lot of people that spoke rather quickly as well. So when I go to other states, I make sure to converge. If they are speaking quicker than I am, then I try to keep up with them. If they have a cadence that's slower than mine, then I try to match that cadence. And that's important because you're non-verbally showing the other person solidarity, that you care, that you're trying to have some sort of affiliation with them, right? And respect how they do things. Divergence is when you speak in a way that emphasizes difference. And I see this quite a lot in intergenerational communication. And so this seems to be an issue between those who are a lot younger and those who are a lot older. I used to volunteer at an organization, and this organization at times would visit the homes of senior citizens and talk to them for companionship, have meals with them. And one of the things that the organization did was it liked to bring on young teens as well, in order to integrate these teens and teach them respect for elders and respect for their senior citizens. And one of the interesting things I saw was, of course, when you look at different generations and their different speech patterns, it can be quite difficult sometimes to maintain interactions if the other person is not converging with you. And so what I found was that when the teenagers, the very young teens, were speaking to the senior citizens, they would get frustrated if the senior citizens couldn't hear them or didn't understand their slang or didn't understand what they were saying or felt they were talking too quickly. And instead of converging with them, right, trying to slow down or trying to match the senior citizens' speaking styles and listening styles, they would raise their voices and say, wait, how come you can't understand me? Do I need to repeat it again? And I would have to tell them, like, I know you're getting frustrated, but speaking louder doesn't necessarily mean that they're understanding it more, right? If anything, you're diverging away from the speaking pattern that would be most helpful for you to interact with these senior citizens. And I see that often as well between individuals, not only that are different ages, but also speak different native languages. And so when someone is whose language is not, first language is not English, for example, I've seen sometimes when people try to communicate with one another, they just raise their voices more, or they try to say more words and have longer sentences. And that's an example of divergence, where you're trying to emphasize the difference of the fact that you're different in age or you're different in native language, rather than converging and trying to find nonverbal or verbal points of similarity where you can keep the conversation going. So divergence, though, has its place, and we see it a lot in powerless and powerful language. Sometimes people want to diverge because they want to show difference between one person and another. We often see that in groups where people are new members to a group, and usually someone who's brand new to a group isn't always welcome with open arms, right? Some examples might be fraternities and sororities. Some examples might be big working companies where you kind of have to, if you're new, quote unquote, earn your stripes, right? And so we see that divergent communication happening a lot when new people enter a company or enter a group or enter a team, because it can be hard for the team to accept someone new right away, right? So the team itself will engage in divergent communication to remind that other person, hey, you're not one of us just yet, right? You're not quite like us. And they usually engage in powerful language in order to do that. Powerful language is direct and forceful declarations or assertions where you try to tell the other person what you want and when you want it and how you want something done, right? Powerless speech is a little bit more tentative, indirect. There's a lot of hesitations. There's a lot of qualifiers. You hedge a lot of your comments. You back up a lot of your comments. You over-explain a lot. And these are important dimensions to remember because, as we learned in chapters 2 and 3, power is always there. It's just the extent to which it is shared, of course. And so it's important to recognize those who have power and those who don't in a situation. And now, as interpersonal scholars, one of the things you can do is identify who in any given situation has the power and who doesn't based off the type of speech they're using. So if you're watching an interaction and someone is using a lot of tentative language and the other person is using a lot of forceful declarative statements, then you know, oh, that person has power, this person does not. And these, of course, are different from politeness. I want to make it clear that politeness is not the same as powerless speech. Students confuse the two, and I get it. It can seem quite similar, but politeness is just for saving face, right? Trying to make sure that both sender and receiver are not embarrassed. Powerless speech isn't so concerned with whether or not someone's embarrassed. Powerless speech is just when you feel you don't have power, and so you're incredibly hesitant in the way that you speak and present your ideas. And so, in moving on, very important, let's go to sexism in language. And I wanted to start off by defining sexist language. And sexist language is any time you unnecessarily, meaning it's not required in that instance, to differentiate between males and females, or when it excludes or trivializes the other sex. And so it's really important to try to use neutral terms when possible, eliminate sex-specific terms, and make sure that when you're referring, that you're referring very clearly to a presenting female or male. And if you are someone who is part of the transgender community, or you know someone who is, it is even more important to use the proper pronouns that that person requests of you. So if a transgender person asks you, for example, I use the pronoun she, then you know that that's the pronoun that that person uses. And so it's really important to mark sex correctly and also mark gender and express gender and share it in proper ways as requested. Racism is also reflected in language. Racism is really the vehicle of racism oftentimes is language. And this is a worldview that classifies people based off their racial group, one being inferior and one being superior. And so it's really important out the bat, of course, to just eliminate those offensive labels and slurs. And also, most importantly, eliminate what we call those innocent uses of racist language, right? And those are a little bit harder to pinpoint because those are a little bit more subtle. They're usually meant to be jokes. But it's important to counteract that and also resist the urge to do that, right? I have 2 videos here about the use of the N-word, where both of these videos kind of provide 2 different perspectives on it. And so it's important that we think of origin of the word, but we also think of present-day use of words as well. As I said earlier in this lecture, humans give words power. Words don't have power in and of themselves. So that means that words can change in their meaning and in who uses them over time. So I encourage you to use those 2 examples to help you understand further. Next up is ambiguous language. These are words and phrases that have more than one commonly accepted definition. Abstraction is when we try to generalize about similarities between objects or people or ideas, various nouns. You may read in your chapter about the abstraction ladder. And so one example of the abstraction ladder would be, for example, if I said the word sports, right? If I broke that down further, that's a very general word, right? It's very abstract, sports. So then I could say something like basketball. Okay, that's pretty specific, but still pretty broad. If I say the word basketball, I could be referring to a lot of things. So then I'll say, okay, NBA, National Basketball Association. Okay, that's a little bit far more specific now. And then I can say the Lakers, right, as a team of the NBA. That's more specific. And even more specifically than that, I can name a player like LeBron James. So the abstraction ladder just reminds us that the higher the level of abstraction, the more vague a statement becomes. The reason for why this is important and why we're studying it is because as an interpersonal communicator, one of the good things you have now, especially since you've read chapter 4, is the ability to perceive someone else's comments and decode them properly. So if someone is using a very high level of abstraction, so they're saying things like sports or very general words, you know to ask further questions, to probe more, ask them, what do you specifically mean by that? And you can kind of identify where they're at in their communication. One real world example of this is when you listen to politicians. Politicians tend to stay very high on the abstraction ladder. They say a lot of very abstract words because it's a lot more difficult to commit to very specific policy plans. Far easier to say things like, oh, let's help the economy, or let's get more jobs, or let's support families and children. Those are incredibly abstract ideas, right? And so you'll find that when you're able to identify where someone is operating in the abstraction ladder, you're more empowered to decode their message appropriately for yourself. And that leads us to our last couple sections on precision versus vagueness, and then we'll move on and talk about I language and the importance of it. And so euphemisms, of course, we've all used euphemisms. An example of a euphemism might be my grandma passed away, right? You say she passed away. You don't say she died. A lot of my friends who have dogs will say that their dog crossed the rainbow bridge, right? Instead of dying. We also have euphemisms for things we don't want to talk about. And typically in society, we don't want to talk about death, we don't want to talk about sex, we don't want to talk about money. And so you find a lot of euphemisms for that, and that is supposed to soften the impact of what we regard as uncomfortable or unpleasant information. And then relative language. Relative language is a tricky one because this is any language that gains meaning by comparison. What that means is that you can only really understand the meaning of one thing if you look at the meaning of another thing. So one example of that is if you go to the doctor, they might ask you, how much pain are you feeling on a scale of 1 to 10? If you say 5, right, it really helps the doctor understand that you're at this mid-level of pain, right? But if the doctor, for example, was to ask you, how much pain are you feeling? And you just said, a lot? That's a piece of relative language. A lot is pretty relative, right? A lot for you couldn't really mean a lot for someone else. If you're a wuss like me, I have a really low pain tolerance. So if I said I'm in a lot of pain, the word a lot for me doesn't really relatively mean the same as it would for any of you, I'm sure. And so that's why doctors have learned to use this 1 through 10 scale to help people more accurately pinpoint their level of pain instead of saying, oh, are you feeling a lot of pain, a little pain, some pain, right? The words lot, little, some are all very relative because they don't have any real form of measurement. Another example might be, let's say you and your friend go out and your friend says, hey, I'm going to go to this really awesome restaurant and the prices are so cheap there. Do you want to go? And you're like, yes, I would love to go to this delicious restaurant that has cheap prices. And you go to the restaurant, you find out that every plate is $20, right? For you, that may not be cheap, but for your friend, that may be cheap. That's another example of relative language, right? Where it doesn't, the word cheap, right, could mean a variety of things to a variety of people. If you were to buy a cheap car, some of you might think a cheap car is $5,000. Some of you might think a cheap car is 10 or 15. Some of you might think a cheap car is 20. And those are really big jumps to make, right? So relative language needs to be avoided in order to try to either turn words into numbers or get as specific as you can on the abstraction ladder. The last one we'll talk about is static evaluation. And this is when we use language to presume that other people are not capable of changing. Oftentimes in our interpersonal conflicts, we may say things like, oh, you always do this, or you never are here for me, or that's just who you are. And we use this very definitive language, right? Always, never, or this is just how it is. And that's an static evaluation. And if you've learned anything from chapters 1 through 4, we've learned that humans are dynamic and changing and have this capability of change just as much as we love being stable and static. And so it's important in our language to recognize that there is this capability of change for both people and the world. So let's talk lastly about the language of responsibility. And the language of responsibility is really this idea that we have to start owning the things that we say to other people. And so I'm going to start off first by talking about how we try to avoid responsibility, and then I will talk about how to own that responsibility. So an it statement is the first way that we try to avoid responsibility. We replace a personal pronoun with its. It's not my fault, right? The very statement, it's not my fault, deflects responsibility. It presumes that there are other things outside of your control that made you mess up, and so none of this is your fault, right? And that may be so. However, the likelihood that there's nothing that any of us could improve upon or get better at is not realistic. And so you'll hear a lot of it statements often in interpersonal conflicts where both people will try to deflect responsibility from one another, and it just perpetuates the conflict and perpetuates the underlying issues. Then we have a but statement. And this is not helpful and should be avoided at all costs because all it does is cancel the thought that preceded it. You may hear people say something like, I'm not trying to be offensive, but, or I'm not trying to be racist, but, or I'm not trying to be sexist, but, and you can know that the thing that comes after that is probably something that's going to be offensive or racist or sexist. And so it's a face-saving strategy, right? Where we try to deflect a lot of what we're saying by saying, well, I don't intend to do this, but at the end of the day, what we've learned using our communication triangle and what we've learned from chapters 1 through 4 is that it doesn't always matter what your intent is, the impact matters, right? But we try to deflect that and say, well, my intent isn't, to be bad, so I'm not going to take ownership over the impact of what I say. And that's not true. If I didn't intend to hurt someone's feelings with a joke, but I definitely did, then I have the responsibility to make sure I recognize that I hurt someone's feelings. Not say, well, I didn't mean to be offensive, but you took it, the wrong way. We have to be able to own the things that we say and not say but, or it, because all that does is cancel out responsibility on our own part. The last type of language I want you to avoid is evaluative or emotive language. This is when you seem to describe what the other person is doing and you sound like you're trying to be objective, but it actually is language that expresses the speaker's attitude towards something. This is when you use very emotionally charged words. So saying things like, well, all you did was you came home and you complained and then you ignored me. The word complain and the word ignored are incredibly charged words, right? Emotionally charged words that will get you and the other person going. You want to describe things to people by saying things like, well, you came home and we didn't really get a chance to talk and it really felt like you wanted to be alone, right? That's very different from saying, well, you were just complaining all the time and you ignored me. So how do we remedy all of these? How do we ignore the its and the buts in the emotive language? We use what we call I language. This is when you gain your own empowerment and you assert what you think you are viewing about the incident. A complete I statement does 3 things, and it has to do all 3 of these things. So if you look at these 3 bullet points, all 3 of them have to be present in order for us to consider it a complete I statement. So the first thing you do is describe the other person's behavior. And like I said before, you describe, you don't try to evaluate, okay? You don't try to use these emotionally charged words. So you describe and you say very purely what you observed. The second thing is you describe your feelings. So you say, well, and I feel hurt. I feel let down. I feel ignored. I feel disappointed. You don't say you made me angry. You say I feel angry, right? And then you describe the consequences of the other person's behavior for you. You say, well, based on what I observed and what I'm feeling right now I feel like I can't trust you because of this issue. So you describe, but what you're doing is you're letting the other person in to correct you. You're saying, well, I perceive that this happened, and so therefore I feel angry and I feel I can't trust you. By saying that, instead of saying you did this, you did that, you're encouraging the other person to join you in on the conversation rather than get defensive, right? There's a big difference between saying you are such a terrible person, right? Or you are not a good friend to me, versus saying like, I really feel like our friendship has changed and I really feel like you're not around for me anymore, right? There's a difference. You're inviting the person in on the conversation by saying I versus saying, well, you. And then you can build on that by saying we language. This usually is used by spouses and families when they're trying to work out conflicts. But it also, of course, can work for other couples and as well as any pairs of people that work intimately together. And so this implies that whatever is the issue is something that both of you have to tackle, right? And so by making both people responsible by using we, again, you're inviting the person in. And that's really what I language is about. It's about taking ownership of what you say instead of deflecting responsibility onto someone else and actually getting to the nitty gritty. I think a lot of us have been in conflicts, fights with other people where we feel like we're just going around in circles, right? And the more you talk with a person, the more you get frustrated, right? And the more you talk, the more they seem to get frustrated. And most of the time, this is because we are not using I language. We're not expressing our feelings. We're not describing the other person's behavior. We're usually spending our time evaluating the other person, telling them that they're good, bad, wrong, and we're using all sorts of adjectives throwing at them. And we're not really getting down to the nitty gritty of what are the consequences of this person's behavior for us, right? For our relationship, for ourselves as individuals. And so I love I language because I think it's such a great way to empower yourself to own your own feelings and own your own thoughts, and say what you want to say, and also invite someone in on the conversation at the same time. So with that being said, that has been our chapter 5. So today we have reviewed the nature of language. We've talked about how language is symbolic. We went through the triangle of meaning and discussed, most importantly, that symbols do not have meaning in and of themselves. Only humans give symbols meaning. Then we talked about sexist language, power in language, racist language, and how language impacts our worldview and how it's important that the words we choose and use will impact the way we see ourselves. And lastly, we ended with a discussion of I language versus you language that we're trying to avoid, right? And so I language is super important, and those 3 components all have to be there for I language to work. You have to be able to describe the behavior, you have to be able to discuss how the behavior made you feel, and you also have to be able to describe the consequences of that person's behavior for you. And those are really important, awesome things to do. So with that being said, I hope this lecture has been helpful, and I will see you all at the next lecture. Bye.